Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some of your peers to log into today's session. But once again, want to thank you for participating in our SMB educational webinar series. We're excited to have John Harden here with us today, and we look forward to talking about shadow IT and some of the effects that it could have on small businesses and some things that you ought to be aware of. So we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Just want to give everybody a chance to log in. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got some people that are just logging in now, and they will be able to catch up and submit questions as we get going. I want to thank everybody once again for coming on board. This is our SMB educational webinar series. This was something the Nodeware Advisory Council asked us to start about 7 months ago. The whole idea was to provide, a public service announcement type orientation to educate small business leaders, owners, and investors on the issues they face around cybersecurity. They are all focused on running their business. They're focused on making sure their data, their critical data stays safe. If, God forbid, something were to happen, they could come back quickly and run their business from a business continuity standpoint. So, this is about executives and investors and owners that want to spend time running their business. They don't want to spend their time on cybersecurity, but we've been trying to provide them a series of updates, whether it's been, compliance from the folks at NIST and CIS 18, whether it's around education from the MIT Sloan School of Business about cybersecurity education, whether it's how MSPs can support small businesses. We've had a series of these topics. Today, we are fortunate enough to talk about shadow IT, and we're going to get into exactly what that means in a minute. But as always, we want to keep these interactive. So if you have a question, please put them in the chat or put them in the question box. We will do our best to get to all of the questions. We have some pre-submitted questions as well, and we will get to those. As always, everything will be on YouTube a couple of days from now. So if you want to, you can go back and view today's discussion. You can also submit questions to us after the fact, and we'll have contact information for you later on that. Just a couple of things specifically, if we skip to the next slide. We have a couple of sessions coming up. As some of you might know, we did a live demo and peer Q&A session last week with a couple of our MSP partners. They got to answer some great questions from people. We're going to continue that process. The next one is on February 10th. So you'll have the ability to get a quick demonstration, also ask your peers any questions. We'll both have end user organizations on as well as MSPs and how they're helping small businesses. And then the next one in this series will be with Ryan Cotier from Security Studio, talking specifically about small healthcare organizations and how they can be assisted. Those are the newest sessions. They're on our website. They're on LinkedIn. You have the ability to register. We want to make them also available to our partners for anybody that they're interested in inviting to come along to those as well. Before we get started with today's presentation, I want to introduce John. John's the founder and the head of business operations at Saaslio. He's got a couple of slides that he's going to go through for us. What I'd like to do is, John, I'd like to ask you a question, and at the same time, we're going to put up a poll question so we can get a little bit of a feel for today's audience. So why don't we just specifically go to, when you talk about unknown, right? How unknown cyber risk jeopardize business. Can you talk a little bit about what does that mean? And at the same time, if our audience can fill out this poll question, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, hey there, Stuart. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk to everybody today about the unknown. And what unknown means for me and what unknown means for the small businesses we're going to talk to today is really that day-to-day usage of unknown things in your organization. It is the shadow IT particularly that we'll hit on here in a moment. But it's the stuff that happens unintentionally. It's the technology that's adopted without maybe proper oversight or proper governance. It's the technology that fuels and runs your business and is part of your innovation, but unchecked, that actually creates a little bit of a security risk. And so we'll talk a little bit that more in depth, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about unknown. And really, when I talk about unknown, I talk about one key element, and it's the fact that most organizations are a little bit under-equipped to handle the unknown. Shadow IT, by definition, is the usage of technology in a business that's not known by the IT manager, the IT vendor. I saw we had a significant amount of people here from the cybersecurity space, maybe unknown by the cybersecurity firms that they're working with. So shadow IT in the most layman's of terms, and the example that always works best to the business owners on the call is, have you ever been frustrated trying to get a document that somebody inside your company stored in a different technology, like put it out on Dropbox instead of or Shared Drive or OneDrive, or maybe they stored a piece of information out of the CRM that's supposed to be there because they've adopted their own piece of technology? That's shadow IT. And the beauty of it is, once you kind of explain it, almost everybody knows what shadow IT is, because there's really yet to be an organization we've seen impervious to it. Because shadow IT in its own nature just kind of is because employees want to be innovative. They go online, they have a business problem, they go online or they download some piece of technology to solve their business problem, and their intention is to drive business outcomes. But what they don't realize is sometimes when downloading softwares, or sometimes when signing up for softwares, or sometimes when putting their critical business data into these third-party softwares, they're actually putting their business into jeopardy, because the business continuity is at risk if that data gets leaked, or if that data gets exposed, or if you put your customer data at risk. So, you know, I'm passionate about this problem because I came from the software industry prior to starting Saaslio, where we saw a lot of shadow IT. And so really, businesses are using SaaS solutions across the spectrum. The remote workforce has kind of exacerbated it, because people are now at home signing up for platforms. They're not in the office collaborating like they maybe used to. And this is once again kind of causing unintentionally big risks for your organization. And the data backs it up. I think if we move on to the next slide, the data around shadow IT talks about these pains in kind of a clear issue. You know, 80% of employees, when surveyed across small business or enterprise, admit to using unsanctioned IT. And once again, they're not doing it because they're coming in and they're trying to be malicious in the organization. They're just trying to, you know, drive innovation or be productive. But organizations admit it. You know, there's nearly 10 times more usage of shadow SaaS and IT in small businesses than sanctioned SaaS. Which is a shocking statistic backed up by a Forrester report, because what actually is happening is people are siloing and using their own line of business apps and never telling IT, thinking it's okay, because the VP of sales maybe said, we're going to start using this project management tool, everybody get on board, but the VP of sales maybe never communicates that internally, and then the VP of marketing is using their own project management tool, and director of IT has their own infrastructure. So the amount of shadow IT is really kind of growing, and we've seen it definitely grow since COVID-19. There's no shortage of the data to support that COVID-19 made it a little bit worse, because as everybody rushed home, not only did they introduce shadow IT in the form of hardware, where they're signing into their personal computers, or they're using their mobile devices to access company resources or assets. They went online and they subscribed to Zoom. They went online and they subscribed to systems to communicate and collaborate and to manage in the virtual world that they're part of. So the data supports it. I mean, 93% of organizations acknowledge that they've got unmonitored shadow IT. And most people aren't apathetic about it. They just don't know that there's solutions out there to resolve it. And so I think in the next slide too, we'll talk a bit about the real numbers that kind of, just jump out and kind of surprise people. The 102 SaaS apps. This is always a number that kind of throws people off mark initially. You think about it day to day, when we survey people, when we talk to CIOs, CTOs, business owners, we always get like one of three answers when we ask about how many applications or how many assets are out there. It's either the 5 to 15 range, the ones you can quickly think of and rattle off in your head, your Workday systems, your project management platforms, your QuickBooks, the things you're familiar with. We either get that answer, we get some ballpark number, which is just a pie in the sky number they believe. It's like 50 or 60. It's just some arbitrary guess out there. Or we get my favorite, which is usually the CEO who says all of them. We use everything. There's no doubt we use everything. And that's often the case, unfortunately, as application adoption has kind of splintered down to the line of businesses self-adopting instead of centralized in IT. We continue to see all of them be closer to the right answer, certainly more than 5 to 10. And the number here, even at 102, I think a G2 report came out just in January, so this number is even a little bit out of date, that puts it closer to 120 to 130. So even in 1 year, we saw an unprecedented 27% growth. So it's continuing to go, and as any business owner, any IT administrator, any security professional knows, if there's a number that's moving up and to the right and it's not something that you're in control of, there's a problem to be resolved. So, I know we'll share these slides and some of this data later, but that's what I mean, Stuart, when I say the unknown. It's the things that you kind of know are happening, but you don't have any visibility or management or monitoring on it. It's that shadow IT, and that's the stuff that we're passionate about here. And I know certainly over with ITI, I know where you're passionate about.
Yeah, I'm curious. One question comes to mind right away. If you're a small business owner and your employees are doing this to try and improve their own productivity, how do you put some sort of guardrails or programs around this at a minimum, so you can keep at least keep critical data away from some of these devices? Yeah,
and this is if we had the silver bullet to this answer, it would be magnificent. But the challenge is that there really is no silver bullet to this answer, but there are processes, there are procedures, there's ways to handle it. Particularly if you're a small business, you are a little bit more apt to adopting shadow IT because business problems kind of spew up everywhere, and maybe you don't have centralized IT, or your IT is outsourced, so you self-adopt technology. What I always encourage and think is a really strategic way to approach shadow IT is to just continually survey or continually engage with your employees about the business problems and the technology they're adopting. In lieu of any technology or any software to solve the problem, one of the most easy ways to talk or to understand what's on in your ecosystem is just to talk to your employees. When they're adopting these innovation platforms or these SaaS platforms or introducing new shadow IT, they're trying to solve a business problem. So by not coming in from the change management perspective of you're doing this wrong, we're going to blacklist it. If we see you putting data into Dropbox again, we're going to put you on a employment improvement plan or something along those lines. Instead of really taking it from a negative perspective and telling them they're doing something wrong, I really think that the question is, what business outcome were you trying to drive by doing this? Because in a lot of cases, like file sharing systems or maybe document management systems, there's already technology in place at your organization, but people may adopt another one because maybe there's just not a feature set available, or maybe that doesn't solve their exact business problem. And so remembering that everybody adopts software for really one of two things. It's to save money or save time, which both translate directly to business problems. Remembering that the adoption of this is usually from the right spot. And shadow IT itself can be remediated by just knowing about it, right? It doesn't fully fix the problem, but by just documenting it, by documenting that the people are having access to the applications, documenting that somebody is using it and what kind of data is in that system. It doesn't have to be anything more than just, maybe a sheet of paper here to get started. I know everybody's got their amazing Excel documents I'm sure they're using too. That's a great starting point because at least it's centralized, and at least whether you're on the journey towards compliancy or whether you're not in the compliance perspective yet, or whether you just want to tighten or strengthen that security perspective, just documenting it is a great starting point because you can't iterate from nothing.
It's interesting that you say that. We just announced some tagging and grouping capabilities inside of Nodeware, so you could not only segment the devices from a vulnerability program management standpoint, but from a network segmentation standpoint, the MSPs and the end users both have the ability to then segment their devices. So it probably leads to an interesting question about, if your employees have these devices, or I should say applications on their devices, and they have access to critical data, you might want to do even a better job of separating them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think understanding what applications they have access to and looking at segmenting those people, very similar to the way that we approach that model with tagging and as well, because if you don't know that there's maybe the PCI data sitting in QuickBooks, or that there's HIPAA data in your EHR platform or ERP type systems, you really are kind of taking a wild guess. And I think even further, Stuart, tagging is really critical for the employee life cycle. If you're not aware of what they had access to throughout their journey in the organization, it's not the same today as it always has been, where an employee joins on, you check a couple boxes on the list, and a year later, maybe it's 1 or 2 new things. It's 10 or 20 new things that maybe they're adopting. They're adopting faster. And so I think tagging is an amazing feature to have in the platform because, employee management and employee access management is rapidly evolving, and it's certainly only getting wider. It's not getting narrower what they have access to and what they're using.
It's interesting. From the first poll question, we have almost an even split between people that work for a cybersecurity or technology company that are interested in getting educated, and maybe how we can partner with them to help these small businesses, but also, about half the people either work for a small or medium-sized business or work for a managed service provider that supports small businesses. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on, if you're a small business owner, what should you be expecting from your MSP to help you so you don't run into trouble, specifically with this slide?
Yeah, I think this is something I really have a pretty strong opinion on, honestly, Stuart. If you're working with an MSP and you're already on services with them, so you've gone past the cycle and you've decided that MSP is going to be the one servicing you, the question, what do you use, should never be a dialogue that they're bringing to the table. I know and I understand over the era that technology is continually changing, and being able to have visibility into it's continually changing, and that the web apps change the way that you have perspective and support and management. But if an MSP that you're working with that's managing your business is coming to you and asking you what you use during that onboard cycle, instead of coming to you and saying, here's what we see you using, why are you using it? Then I think it's kind of a good question to ask yourself, because if they don't know, and if you go back to my questions I made earlier, or my point earlier when I said when you ask somebody what they use, they have 1 of 3 answers. If they're asking you, what that means is they're not getting a complete picture. And a complete picture, as we know, is just almost about as fundamental in the security process or pipeline or IT roadmap as possible. Whether you're the security groups online or you're the small business, a very clear tenet of cybersecurity is visibility. You cannot protect what you don't know. And if your MSP is coming to you, I understand their MSP may not be your security vendor as well, but if your MSP is coming to you and they're asking you what you're doing, that's a question that you might really want to take a little bit more curiously, because I would certainly be a bit surprised if my MSP asked me that.
What about just take it from the from an investor or from an owner or from a an executive at a small business. Let's just talk a little bit more about whether it's educating your employees or whether it's educating your board to the risks or whether it's helping your investors understand, the potential attacks that could come their way. Maybe from an owner standpoint or from a business leader standpoint, you could talk a little bit about how do you begin to educate people on all of these SaaS applications and the potential problems they may face?
Yeah, I think that the education component is the most critical because application and shadow IT management is a cultural thing. It's not a band hammer on the firewall that blocks them out from having access to it. It's really a cultural transformation. You have to make people feel empowered to adopt technology, but understand that there's a process behind it. And I think from an education perspective, I want to believe that most employees in an organization, and especially in the businesses hopefully we're talking to today, have it in their right mindset to do what's best for the company. And I think highlighting people's adoption of technology and innovation in the organization and making it a good thing is probably the most important step, right? If somebody's found a new piece of technology that's making their line of business or their business unit or their group more effective, highlighting that as transformation across the organization is super valuable because, you talked about, Stuart, a couple things, right? Like how should the business owner educate? I think highlighting these things is one way to educate because it gets that fear away of, oh no, I'm not supposed to be using this tool. It's like, well, oh no, maybe I'm using this and I'm helping the company. But when you look at today's ecosystem, companies are valued on a lot of different things. So switching kind of in that investor perspective, companies are valued on a lot of different things. And to say that the process or the automations or the technology profile or the way they deliver service to their customer isn't something that should be exemplified in that valuation would be pretty hard to ignore. I mean, an organization who's become very cloud forward and has built lots of automation through lots of SaaS applications can service more customers maybe more effectively, and that should be part of that valuation statement. So I think that most people know that technology is critical. I think we had to accept that fate a long, long time ago. But highlighting the value of technology in your organization to say, if you want to innovate in an area, innovate, but just bring it in-house and don't make it your own little side project. Maybe think before you sign up for that free trial of 30 days to talk out to the or to your IT manager or talk to your business leader and say, I'm thinking this is a business problem I have. Do we have something else in our software stack that solves it? Do we have something else in our ecosystem where this should be? Because that question often will actually result in less software because there's usually something out there. It's just usually about educating and learning about the softwares. And, I think that as we look over the next 5-10 years, you're going to see a really dedicated role to managing software in almost any small business or medium business outside just an IT manager, because softwares can do more and more and more these days, and there's a lot of overlap. So having somebody manage that, I think definitely is a future role.
One of the things we have given to our partners that's had a huge success for them has been, we have this 2-minute sales sheet that they use that literally says, ask your client, do you know when a new device comes on your network? And do you want to know? And then 2, if that device has any vulnerabilities, that could be exploitable by the bad guys, do you want to immediately know? Right? And those 2 questions kind of lead very quickly to whether you need a real-time during normal business hours vulnerability management, and you need vulnerability program management to meet your compliance opportunities. And we've had partners that have had great success with it. I'm curious from your standpoint, if you're an IT administrator at either an end user organization or at an MSP, and you start identifying, shadow IT activities, what should you do?
Yeah, and that is a question that has lots of facets, because really managing shadow IT is a blend of IT practices and processes and organizational change management. And so if you are an IT administrator that sees a brand new usage of an application, it really kind of splinters into different things. One, how much, what's the criticality of that application? I mean, somebody adopting their own time tracking tool just because they want to manage data, manage their day more effectively is far and vastly different than somebody adopting their own file sharing platform. One, sure, they might expose their own personal information, or in that time tracking tool, I'm sure they could put entries that might register to a client's data. But the other is not okay, because in today's world, if I'm putting data into Dropbox or Box, and by the way, I'm not saying those are bad vendors, they're just very common shadow IT offenders. If I'm putting data into Dropbox and Box and I leave in 12 months, for instance, Stuart, I leave, what normal IT administrators are going to do is they're going to deactivate Azure, they're going to go remove, or Azure or Workspace or whatever identity manager they've got. They're going to go remove access from the line of business applications that they know of, and they're going to do their best to remediate and remove this customer. But if I went in there a year ago during a CRM migration and put a big customer list in that Dropbox platform to get it to a vendor, and I signed up with my email, john.harden@saaslio.com, and I created my own password, password 1234, which, by the way, that's not my password. If I go out and about a month later, I've been terminated and I've been revoked from everything in my business, I can still go log into Dropbox. Nothing's stopping me. There's nothing that's restricting my access from using my username and password combination. If it was never built into the enterprise app identity manager, then I still have access to that. So that CRM migration where I maybe dropped that customer list to help a vendor that we were working with, I've now got constant access to it. And that's why I think the statistic out there was a cyber firm that did a research, I'd have to find it exactly, but like 90% of employees have access to softwares that they're part of or that they signed up for when they leave a company. And so it's a long-winded example, but I think it exemplifies the problem. So when a shadow IT comes in, it's absolutely critical, whether it's sanctioned or not, that you're working with this employee to understand why it's there. It's absolutely critical that if you are going to adopt it, you assign ownership in the organization of who's going to manage it. Like somebody has to accept that risk. If the sales team says they want to have Dropbox, okay, but the VP of sales has to kind of sign off and say, I'm okay with Dropbox in the organization and I acknowledge the risks and I'll manage it, versus had it just kind of ran rogue through the organization and data potentially leaking out of the company, customer lists, more compliant information potentially leaking out. So there's a lot of cases in which managing is the most critical. And I think there's three easy things to add, whether it's an Excel sheet, a piece of paper, a system that's built for it, just who owns it, who's going to handle employee offboarding on it, and is it approved, not approved, and what's its purpose. The most simplest of things can really make managing your software assets and your software applications a lot easier.
To that point, could you talk a little bit more about the role that either, maybe a vendor has that's supplying some of these applications? What's the role the vendor has to help educate the end user on potentially the risks and how they should be aware of it and potential vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think that to a degree, vendors really kind of need to step up and work with these IT administrators, and I think they do in most cases. But I had a really popular post that I made earlier in the year when SaaStr came out with their annual metrics. I think it was something like 41 new unicorns a month were created. And a unicorn, for people that don't follow that space, means it's a new billion-dollar company was created. So 41 a month billion-dollar companies created in SaaS. My post essentially said, that's 41 new sales reps that are going to call your VP of sales and tell them you don't need to include IT on this deal. You don't need to bring in IT. Like, you can go sign up online. Don't worry about it. IT doesn't need to be part of the story. And not saying that all 41 a month are doing that, or all 500 last year, whatever the exact metric was, are doing all that. But I know that a lot of vendors out there do kind of go into that route. I think there's a little bit of responsibility that has to be had if you're introducing technology into somebody's business and you're taking their critical business data in. I think that you own a responsibility in ensuring that it's not shadow IT. Now, how to crack that nut is beyond me, because if you're introducing SaaS and you're out there trying to get your customer base to grow and you're growing through sales, you don't want to slow down the cycle. But I think just clearly communicating to the people that you're talking about, like, sanction this internally. And I think in the long run, if you actually sanction it internally, the organization, if you go through IT and you pass their security processes and you pass all the questions they need, IT is going to be more open to working with you as a vendor, because then they're going to say, well, now I know about it, so when a new business problem comes to me, well, we can just adopt more of this platform instead of introducing 3 or 4 splintered applications that all serve the same purpose. So I think as a vendor, you really want to build that relationship with IT, as much as you might be coached in certain sales to not bring in IT because they're just going to say they're the no guys. If you're really building software that creates value, and Stuart, that's our mantra here at Saaslio, is like, every software should provide value. If you are a vendor that's providing value, you shouldn't be scared to talk to IT. You should open and embrace it, because that's another entry point to the organization that can be your champion. So I think vendors have a lot of responsibility into it, and there's good, there's bad, and there's in between, just like everything else.
Well, I think, historically, being both on the vendor side and on the end user side, I think vendors have done, quite frankly, a terrible job as it relates to cybersecurity and helping not only educate, but help, as it relates to the responsibilities that they bring when they bring technology on board, especially in a SaaS environment, and the ultimate risk downstream that causes. So, I'm glad to hear you say the things you're saying about the vendors. It's something that we take very seriously at IGI, both on the cybersecurity services side and on the cyber lab side. It's critically important, and it's important to support the customer that way. We did get a question about the webinar being recorded. Yes, it will be recorded. Yes, we will have it on YouTube. Yes, it'll be available, and we'll have these slides available as well. So if you have any other questions, just as a reminder, please put them into the chat or put them into the question box, and we will make sure we get to them. Let's talk about blocking applications. That's always an interesting scenario, right? Should the MSP be blocking applications as they're supporting an organization? And if you're a sole IT or security person at an organization trying to support, 5 people, 50 people, 100 people, should you be blocking applications, or how do you work with the users, if you will, on that?
Yeah, I'm smiling because that's the question that's the result, right? Like, I found these bad things, let me block them. And I think that, once again, that chimes in on the cultural component of shadow IT and the cultural component of technology and innovation. We're seeing a massive shift in the way that employees want to work in organizations. Almost no organization has been impervious to the great, forgetting the exact term, all the employees shifting around. I know there's a fantastic term for it, but no business has been impervious to employees moving and leaving. I think blocking is one of those things that you just want to be very cognizant about. Now, there's a difference between blocking personal. There's maybe a difference between blocking malicious. But when it comes to blocking applications that employees really rely on, you need to make sure you're understanding the cultural damage you're potentially implementing by doing so. And I say that specifically to the MSPs that maybe aren't building deep relationships with their customers and clearing it, or the IT admin that maybe has a trigger finger to blocking things. And I understand why, right? Like, it's easy, you block it, problem solved. But there was a great educational resource I read on what employees want in today's world. And employees want a little bit of autonomy, and they want to feel like they're part of the innovation in companies. They don't want to feel like they're just another cog. And I think that if an employee has the wherewithal to go innovate in the company, and your response is, well, I'm blocking that, that's not part of it, you might need to evaluate that. And I understand there's a difference, right? There's a difference between innovating to be helpful and innovating to do things like, make the business more effective. And then there's the, file sharing and document management systems and HIPAA. I get that. Like that probably deserves its own use case of a block's probably okay to stop the behavior. But you can't expect employees to be driven when your reaction to them trying to adopt or innovate is to block. And that's why I say all the time that application adoption and technology adoption is cultural, even to the point of just top-down approaches. When you're coming in and you're deploying this new CRM and you want everybody to adopt it, you don't go in and say, here it is. You might, but you don't go in and say, hey, go use Salesforce now. The old system's gone. You spend a lot of time understanding what they did in the old system. Spend a lot of time understanding to make sure you don't lose business process. You make sure you introduce it right. You have good change management around it. I think that same level of business focus on, maybe a migration should be applied to a stopping of shadow IT, because the last thing you want to do is send that employee packing, looking for another company that's maybe more innovative for them, because you decided that you didn't want them using this piece of technology and you didn't include them in the discussion of the risks. You didn't include them in the discussion of why they're using it. You didn't make them feel like they're part of the company, because I know right now, I wish I had the link, I'd send it out. Maybe I'll send it out after. Fantastic logistical Sam Piles article out there by a big economics professor that talks about one of the number one attributes employees are looking for right now is feeling included. And if they're at home trying to innovate and you're just blocking, that's sure one way to make them not feel included.
Well, we have always done a couple of poll questions, but I think with today's audience, I think it's important. We've always had some poll questions about vulnerability scanning, because we have found, and as I mentioned, our partners find that somebody who used to do a vulnerability management scan once a month on a Sunday night when nobody was logged in was interesting, but not terribly meaningful. And now most of the compliance requirements won't allow that. They need vulnerability program management, not just a vulnerability management scan. So we have a couple of poll questions that we want to put up. We're going to put one up specifically around SaaS, around the SaaS ecosystem. So if you could answer that question, that would be great. And then we will get to, specifically during normal business hours from a vulnerability scan and continuous use. But I think it's important that we take a look at this and kind of see what people have to say as it relates to it. And John, while we're waiting for the answers, just curious, we just posted the answers to it. You can see there's probably more people, answered yes than I would have anticipated. So I think that's a good sign.
Absolutely.
While more than 50% are unsure or don't, I'm surprised as high as it is. Maybe that speaks to the number of software vendors we have on today's call.
Yeah, well, and I think, Stuart, to add to this, that we won't send out another poll to really elaborate on it. But I think there is a maturity level along that curve too, right? There is a maturity level of monitoring and management. So I'm ecstatic to see that number that high personally, right? That means that people know it's a problem and are aware of it. So thrilled to see that. But there is an entire journey that it takes on, and that journey starts with knowing. And so I'm glad to see that 45% know. We won't ask about it, of course, but I'd be curious to know, beyond the knowing, are they properly asset managing these applications? Are they watching for web applications? Are they handling offboards with data to drive their practice? There's a maturity curve, just like the Nodeware platform accelerates that maturity curve on how they're doing it to go from Sunday nights to real time. So we won't pull the thread there, but I am just curious down the road, where people will end up seeing this as a requirement for the other non-45% of people.
Yeah, if you get a chance, please fill this out. We'll leave it up for a couple more seconds, and then we can talk a little bit about this specifically. But it's interesting to see. Once again, I think this speaks to the number of vendors that are potentially on today's call interested in learning more about shadow IT and how they can better educate their clients and their business partners. But it's interesting to me that you still see over well over 30% that are trying to do weekly or monthly scanning, right? Or don't do regular scanning, or not sure. I mean, it just speaks to the number of attacks that are coming the way of small businesses. And, getting back to the two questions I asked, right? Do you know when a new device shows up on your network, and do you care? And then second of all, if that device is potentially exploitable by the bad guys, do you want to know? And those two questions tend to drive the kind of getting started. And as maybe you ought to elaborate on that. If you're a small business and you haven't done much as it relates to cybersecurity, Alan Alford used to talk about the three legs of the stool, and we had the folks. We had one of the folks on talking about multi-factor authentication a couple of months ago, and she talked about, if you just start with some simple education, you start with multi-factor authentication, and you start with a vulnerability scan during normal business hours to understand what your risks and vulnerabilities are. That's not a bad place to start. Maybe from a Saaslio standpoint, what you would suggest a small business do to get started. Let's start there, and then we can talk about an MSP's role in that.
Yeah, and that's the world we're in, right? Like, there's two-factor authentication, there's network scanning, hardware scanning, SaaS scanning. It's like you feel like the universe is constantly expanding around you as you try to secure your organization. And we know it's tough. That's why Saaslio exists, is to make it a little bit easier. If I were to look at entry points, when I look at, security obviously is not technology. You're not dropping a piece of technology and you're secure. Boom, perfect. Like, if that were the case, there'd probably be a trillionaire out there somewhere that figured it all out. But because security is a blend of technology and process and education, and it's multi legs of the stool, like you said, Stuart, you have to focus on those three legs when you look at SaaS. So from a scanning perspective, our platform helps kind of from that technology perspective. It's a leg of the stool that gives you visibility. But that second leg of the stool is about management. Once again, we hit it again. If you're managing SaaS, you know about it. What is it doing? What kind of data does it have? Who's managing it? Do you have proper business process around it? And then on the process leg of the stool, how are you handling onboard of technology? Are you validating that the vendors are hosting your data in secure environments? Have you verified that these vendors don't have data breaches in their past history? Have you validated that their SLAs are protecting your data, or that their data is backed up and redundant? There's a lot of question you get down into vendor security posture management. But I just think that if you're a small business and that seems overwhelming, there's a really easy starting point, and it's not going to get all your shadow IT. Just go look at QuickBooks, go look at your ledger, go look at where you're spending your money. That's what I always say to the small business that doesn't want to put a ton of time or effort into doing a full SaaS survey. Just look where those $19.99, $4.99, $15.99, $16.99 death by 1,000 cuts are coming in. Use that as a starting point. Now, you're not going to get the whole picture. You're not going to get the rogue adoption where it's free trials, and you're not going to get the rogue adoption where people maybe are hitting it on their P cards and their own employee cards. But it's a good starting point. And just like you said, Stuart, you got to start somewhere. And if you don't want to introduce a whole stack of technology to resolve it, I always think that's one of the best points to start at. And then you can kind of percolate and, once again, earlier, mature your management of SaaS as you go.
Let me step to kind of the other side of it. If you're a managed service provider and you've been providing IT support or desktop support, I always refer to it as, sometimes break fix, not necessarily from an hourly standpoint, but break fix from a desktop standpoint. We've been educating a lot of MSPs as to how do you take the first few steps into providing cybersecurity or a cyber hygiene plan, if you will, not necessarily all the way to enterprise risk management, because, that is a huge, jump across the chasm. But just from a getting started standpoint, do you have any thoughts on, as an organization gets started, or as an MSP starts to transition from IT support and desktop support to cyber, how they ought to look at addressing some of these shadow IT applications.
Yeah, and Stuart, I think we share the same sentiment, right? There's a chasm to be jumped, so by no means are we trying to put the fox in the hen house here and saying not only can you support them, but you're also going to validate externally. So I think that really simple hygiene tasks around shadow IT are, I mean, even as simple as just doing scans or continuous engagements. Our platform's built and designed to do that scan and automated engagement for you with no interaction. But if you choose to, forego that level of automation and you want to understand, I know that every MSP has constantly been coached around their IT roadmap. Make sure that one of those segments of your IT roadmap is application management, software application management. And I don't mean that because there's a lot of misconceptions. I don't mean that in just what software is installed on the computer, because that's useful if you're looking for vulnerability scans or you're looking for outdated software that has exposure to your organization. But like, talk about software application management and a larger scale on your IT roadmap. It's a unique opportunity if you're an MSP. Like, you want to mature from the break fix shop. Fantastic. I think as you talk about IT, you have a unique perspective with SaaS and applications particularly, because it's tough to talk sometimes to a business owner about why one piece of IT matters or not, or why they need the X, Y, and Z. They're usually just going to trust you. But applications are this very unique perspective in IT where it's part IT and part business. You actually get to have a business conversation with your customers. It shouldn't be they use this CRM platform, plop it in your wiki or plop it into a documentation system. Great. They have, Salesforce, they have HubSpot. That's a piece of data we have now. It should be why are you using these applications? It should be business conversations when you're talking about software applications. And so that's, Stuart, why we find people enjoying what we're helping them do is we give them visibility to get rid of the what, and it turns into the why. And as you know, Stuart, an MSP that's really on that evolution scale of getting out of the break fix and the reaction, knowing more about their organization and having more why conversations around what you're doing means you've kind of moved it into that proactive model. You get a lot of the things that are breaking remediated, you resolve the vulnerability risks, you're constantly watching, and then you move it into the business conversation. And that's what I've seen the truly great and rapidly growing MSPs do, is they're not just coming to those QBR discussions or those VCIO discussions with a big old checklist, or not a big old checklist, but a big old sheet of 1,000 things. They're coming in with really poignant discussions around their ecosystem and their IT ecosystem and their security hygiene. And they're talking about all the applications, all the hardware, all the network infrastructure. They're coming in and they're saying, where do you want to go with your business? And how can IT align with that? And that is an MSP conversation versus, here's the 12 tickets we did last month. Here's the scan that we ran right before here. Here's the scan that we put in here. And here's a few check boxes I hit before a QBR discussion. Because that'll unlock so much revenue for your MSP if you're having business conversations, because every business is technology enabled. So you should be having business conversations every QBR, every IT roadmap, every monthly meeting, whatever it is, because that's where the owners that are on this call are going to resonate, because that's what they do all day. They run a business. They want to make sure it's protected, of course, but they also want to make sure it's running at best capacity.
So, it's hard to imagine we're 49 minutes into the conversation and we haven't mentioned COVID and hybrid workforce and work from home. But how much effect has all the work from home done to shadow IT, as well as the unique requirements that's now put on people that are trying to provide, vulnerability management and making sure critical data is secure?
Yeah, Stuart, I think IT managers can agree that it got really hard really fast, and a lot of them reacted and were able to get a work from home hybrid environment. The fortunate ones were the ones that saw hybrid coming or already had hybrid in the organization and maybe had a distributed network or some access management that's beyond their business network. But it has certainly got harder. There was a data point I covered earlier, which is like 59% growth in shadow IT since COVID-19 started. that's astronomical. Like that is outpacing all the other numbers here. Because if you even look at this chart that we're sharing, that 2015 to 2020, I mean, we saw 6 times growth over 5 years, but we saw nearly 1/3 times, or 1/3 times growth over the period of COVID starting and now, or 2/3 rather. So because people aren't maybe checking in regularly on their VPNs, or maybe because the networks are shifting in the way that people work in their business applications, it does get tough. But that's where I think, Stuart, you and I have resonated so much in the fact that like having visibility is the first start. And so having network discovery or hardware discovery tools and having software discovery tools that are software driven, that aren't reliant on sitting at your firewall level, that aren't reliant on your traditional network infrastructure, that can be in today's modern workforce where there's a blend of people doing BYOD, there's a blend of people using desktops and laptops that are just sent out to their office and they never even check in the office. I think the remote workforce makes it harder, but we all know the reality, it's not going anywhere. So, I'd be hard pressed, I think, to find an IT administrator that has not started armoring up around this environment, and the fact that it's going to be here for good, and the fact that networks are changing and the way that infrastructure is built and designed is changing as a result. So I think that there's just a stack of software that's going to be required to work in this employee workforce, ironically enough, more software to solve the software problems. But I just think that it's a good natural evolution. It's maybe a problem. Shadow IT is not new, Stuart. 10 years ago when I was working in an IT MSP, we had shadow IT. That doesn't mean we were bad or that we didn't have good cyber hygiene. It just meant that it was hard to track then. It's only recently, as it's become such a quickly growing curve, that it's become a higher priority in the cyber roadmap. So, I mean, I guess to kind of summarize that, we know remote's not going anywhere, and as a result of people working from home, the rules and workforce stopping that might have been there before, where somebody sees you over your shoulder adopting Dropbox, or maybe you've got network rules blocking it. Those are changing and shifting. So it's kind of the time to change and shift to the remote workforce. So just making sure you have proper technology to support that, I think, is probably the most critical component.
Maybe it's worth, we just got a question that came in. If we're 100% remote organization, and we don't have a full-time IT or security person, what should we do?
That is a dangerously loaded question. I'm happy to answer, but Stuart, I'd also love to get your perspective on this after I kind of rattle where I go. I mean, I work in the MSP ecosystem. I think that managed service providers are a very logical space to go to if you're a small business that doesn't have in-house resources. I always say that the MSP community is growing for a reason. I mean, IT is getting wider and wider and wider. We're sitting here talking about SaaS shadow IT, which 4 years ago would have never been a discussion. But it's grown to a bigger problem. And just like hardware shadow IT that your company helps solve, Stuart, and just like vendor attack and third-party security posture management, there's so many nuances in security and so many very specific segments of security and IT hygiene that it's almost impossible for a single administrator to even be able to support it all. So that's why I think MSPs are growing so effectively, because you can have 1/10 of an employee supporting this problem for 10 different customers. 1/10 of a security VCISO or VCIO supporting 10 customers. And so, my answer is a bit opinionated because I think the ecosystem's growing and I think it's well warranted to grow. But I would say at least find some outside counselors, some outside assistance, and at a minimum, do the checklist items. Make sure you've got endpoint protection on your devices so you don't get bit locked, and make sure that you have some protection in your cloud resources, two-factor authentication. There's lots of really easy steps out there to at least increase that hygiene from maybe a C- or an F up to a C+, and that's better than nothing. It's a long journey for sure. Stuart, maybe what are your thoughts? I'd be curious.
Well, I go back to what Alan Alford said, right? This is about, if you're 100% remote and you don't have a full-time IT or security person, I would first and foremost get connected with an MSP. I'd have that MSP start to provide you, some desktop support. I'd have them, run a vulnerability management scan during normal business hours, so you can see, once again, getting back to those two questions, right? Get an alerts every time a new device comes on, especially with everybody remote. The other thing is, if you're all working from home, this was a byproduct when I got to Nodeware. We have people that instead of running an agent on a corporate device because they're at home, they're running a sensor, and the sensors come for free. They run a sensor because they want to know what's on their home Wi-Fi, because what they're finding is if they live in urban environments, there's people bootlegging into their Wi-Fi that are potential, vulnerability risks above and beyond the traditional, camera, doorbell, printer problems of Wi-Fi. So I would say that, and then I would say, start the education process. A little bit of education on cyber hygiene, on what to click on, what not to click on, as well as some multi-factor authentication go a long ways, especially with everybody on home Wi-Fi's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's just it. There's 1,000 different ways to solve there's 1,000 different segments of things to improve. I think the most important thing is just start improving, right? Just take the leap. Find, there's some low-hanging fruit that certainly can be done. That's why I say the MSPs are always a good resource. Maybe you're not ready for that yet, but find one that can coach you and guide you and educate you. But yeah, I love your answer, Stuart. I think it makes a ton of sense.
So we've got 4 minutes left. Why don't, if you wouldn't mind, you want to provide a couple of other thoughts from just some closing remarks, and then I can just tell people about some things that we have coming up. Here's how they locate you. Obviously, if they want to connect with you, as I said, we will have this recording on YouTube. We'll have the slides available, and we'll be happy to answer any follow-on questions either through these email addresses, or if you want to connect with us on our event on LinkedIn, we're happy to have the collaborative discussions there.
Yeah, Stuart. Yeah, thanks for giving me the time here for closing remarks. I think I'll leave it here. Hey, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for all the attendees that engaged with the questions. They were fantastic questions. I appreciate the engagement. It makes it way more fun for Stuart and I up here. I'll leave with the closing remarks of, we're here to help as well. Just like Stuart's group does fantastic, amazing work on the shadow IT and your network and in your hardware and in your infrastructure. We believe we do a fantastic job on that SaaS ecosystem. So if you're interested in more, obviously the contact information is here. But we also offer a 30-day trial for free where you can try the product, see if it's something that fits into your cyber hygiene model. No credit card sign up, no gotchas. Just reach out to us and we'd be happy to give you a 30-day trial.
Perfect. Yeah, we as well, we provide trials for anybody that's interested in just finding out, what are the issues you have. We also, through our MSP partners, you can get a trial through them. No credit card, no responsibilities from that standpoint. Also, if you're not ready for a trial, you're not ready for an evaluation, we have those open demo peer Q&A sessions. We have next one coming up on the 10th in a week. So if you want to just listen in, you want to ask a couple of questions on the chat, you want to see what other people are asking or how those answers come in, you're more than welcome to do that. We also have last week's session on YouTube as well. So we have a variety of ways to help you get involved. I mean, I think it comes down to the same thing, right? How do you help people get started, right? If you're an owner, if you're a business leader, if you're an investor, how do you know your data is protected, and what are you doing to help make sure that your critical data is secure? So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating on today's session. We'll look forward to seeing you on the upcoming sessions. And as always, we want to make sure these are an opportunity to educate folks. So if there's anything you have, any questions you want to submit, please let us know. And we're happy to help small businesses that are under attack be a little bit smarter and a little bit safer. So with that, thank you very much for your time. John, thank you for your time. And for everybody in attendance, thank you for today's participation.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, everybody.